Am I on? Good to see y'all tonight. Take your Bibles, and you're just going to have to hold on to them because we're going to be going a lot of different places tonight. This is to me, a really neat lesson. Maybe it's because I spent a lot of time digging this out. So let's just kind of get where we are in the life of Paul. So Paul is in Roman imprisonment. At the end of the book of Acts, Luke tells us that Paul spent 2 whole years. Now that's an ending point, isn't it? So I want you to see that right now. If you can say, I spent 2 years in prison, well, there's an end to that. And so we're going to talk about, was there an end to Paul's Roman imprisonment, the first one? And if so, what happened between his first Roman imprisonment and his death? We'll have to talk about his death eventually. Everybody has to die, and Paul did. And how he did, we'll talk about that as well. So we're talking about Paul's possible journeys beyond the Roman imprisonment. Now, by way of review, and I might take a little extra time with Onesimus, because that's the section of last week's lesson we didn't really get a chance to get to. Although I don't feel too bad about that, because I preached a sermon this summer on Onesimus, so y'all remember that. So we're all good. Paul was arrested. We've been there a while. He'd been in Jerusalem, Caesarea for 2 years. Great ministry. That's the emphasis that I wanted to make last week. I tried to scream that, tell you many times, Paul was not just a prisoner. He was still a missionary. He was still doing the work of the Lord. And as I say, this first Roman imprisonment was less imprisonment and more ministry by the Apostle Paul. Paul's words during this imprisonment time was all about the opportunities that God had given him and all of the people that he had met, and people had been saved. For example, Onesimus. So the book of Philemon is all about Onesimus. It's one of those short little books in the back of the Bible that we forget about. It's a unique letter, different from all of Paul's other letters. It is Paul writing to a friend, Philemon. It is connected to the letter to the Colossians, the book of Colossians. And Philemon was in Colossae. And his son, Archippus, was most likely the replacement pastor of Epaphroditus, who had gone to Paul to talk to him about the Colossian issues. And so the Colossian church was most likely meeting in Philemon's house. And Philemon owned a slave, and that goes down kind of crooked for us, doesn't it? And we don't like slavery, and we don't like to remember that in our past history, and we're kind of ashamed of it. But in that period of time, that's the way the economy worked. If Jesus, which he could have, went about and said, well, I'm going to free all the slaves, it would have shut down the economy. And there would have been a lot of former servant slaves starving because they had no means of making a living. And so, right, wrong, or indifferent, it is what it is. And many of the slaves were a part of the people's households. It was just as when Abraham, hate it when I do that. Y'all help me. John Owen, help me. Abraham's servant named sorry? You don't know either. He has a name. And what? Eleazar. Thank you. One of those easy names. Eleazar was, prior to Abraham having children, Eleazar was a son to him. And he said to the Lord, why don't you just consider my servant Eleazar? He's a rightful heir. And so it was similar to that. Onesimus seemingly had done some things wrong. I don't know what. But Paul indicates that Onesimus had done some wrong things. Maybe that's why he ran away. Regardless of all of that, the important thing is Onesimus met Paul, who introduced him to the Lord. And Onesimus, and Paul said, was unprofitable to you, to Philemon, is now profitable. By the way, Onesimus' name means profitable. And he said, now you're not receiving a servant, you're receiving a brother in Christ. And Paul does indicate that maybe Philemon ought to let him go. He even asked that Onesimus would come back and help him out. I can't tell you how all that ended. I think it ended well, for the book of Philemon is in the Bible. And if it was an embarrassment during that time, if it was just if Philemon beat the phooey out of Onesimus or killed him, well, we wouldn't want that in the Bible, would we? We wouldn't want that with some kind of book like that in the Bible. So I think the inclusion of Philemon in the Bible indicates that Onesimus was set free. And I can tell you what history says, that Onesimus actually became one of the pastors in the church at Ephesus. That's 2nd century, but that's possible. Onesimus may have been a young man, and in the 2nd century there is mention of an Onesimus who was a bishop in Ephesus in the early church fathers' writings. So that's the story of Onesimus, and this all happened during Paul's Roman imprisonment. He met Onesimus, he led him to the Lord, and seemingly got him on his way in serving the Lord. Next slide, we see that Paul was busy writing. I've learned this the last several weeks. It takes a lot of time to write. Even if you're inspired of God, it takes a long time to write. And Paul wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon while he was in prison. He says in the book of Philemon, but meanwhile, also prepare a guest room for me, for I trust that through your prayers I shall be granted to you. Now we turn the slides and we start looking at, Paul said in many places, I'm fixing to be released. I'm about to be released. So how did that happen? If Paul was released, well, how did he come to his release? Did he appear before the Caesar? During this time, go ahead and go to the next slide. Well, let me read this verse. The Caesar during this time was Nero. In Acts 27, 23, and 24, and this is why Paul is on the boat. And the Lord appeared to him by an angel in the night. And the Lord had said to him in Acts 27, 24, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. I think that pretty much settles it for me. Did Paul appear before the Caesar? God said he did. And I looked deeply into this sentence here, and that's exactly what it means. You must be brought to appear before the Caesar. And so I think Paul did appear before the Caesar. Now let's look at this Caesar. His name was Nero. Nero the Nut. Just remember that. Not only do I say that some 2,000 years removed, people of his time said Nero was off his rocker. I'll read some stuff here that I basically copied out of books. His infamous reign is associated with tyranny, extravagance, and debauchery. Most Roman sources describe Nero as excessive and unbalanced. You have any unbalanced people here tonight? Others say that he was compulsive and corrupt. Nero was the adopted heir of Emperor Claudius. Do you remember Claudius? He appears in Scripture. He was the one who kicked all the Jews and Christians out of Rome. That was why Aquila and Priscilla were in Corinth. He was the adopted heir of Emperor Claudius, his great uncle and stepfather. How does that happen? How can you be a great uncle and a stepfather all in the same person? You know how that happens. But that's just sickening to me. Anyway, you got to marry your sister? Is that how that works? Nero succeeded Claudius at age 17, and his mother, Agrippina, tried to rule through him. But Nero had her killed. Who does that? Who kills their mother? 5 years into his reign. He ruled during the beginning of the Jewish-Roman wars. Remember that this resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The Jewish-Roman relations had always been a problem and eventually escalated to the Jewish rebellion. After Nero's reign, Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. Roman historian, and I can't say his name, says that many Romans believed that the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 was instigated by Nero to clear the way for his planned complex that would be named after him. And Dominus and these other people said Nero seized Christians as scapegoats for the fires and burned them alive, seemingly motivated not by public justice, but by personal cruelty. This began the great persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. Nero was unpopular among the aristocracy of Rome because of his high taxes and undiplomatic rulership. In his absence, they tried Nero and condemned him to death. Before he could be executed, Nero committed suicide in 68 AD, sparking civil war in Rome for 4 years. Many early Christian texts say Nero ordered the execution of both Peter and Paul. Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the early church fathers, was the first to write explicitly that Paul was beheaded and Peter crucified in Rome during the reign of Nero, somewhere around 64-65 AD. Paul was beheaded because Roman citizens were normally exempt from crucifixion. There were other sources that claim Paul was burned with other Christians by Nero in Rome. So that's kind of, I admit, I didn't do all the citations there because I'm not writing this for academic purposes, but that came from a lot of Roman history sources. And so there's a lot there. So this is the guy that Paul would have appeared before. There's all kinds of writing about it, historical. But we're here to study the Bible. And so what we're going to look at is what the Scriptures say about Paul's potential appearance before the Caesar. All right, next slide. Slide number 9. You're there. Thank you. So was Paul released or killed during his first Roman imprisonment? Were there 2 Roman imprisonments? And if 2, then why was Paul released the first time? Well, here's the possible outcomes according to Roman law. This is what could have happened. Number 1, conviction and execution. Number 2, conviction and a much stricter confinement. There are Christian writers who think that there was just 1 Roman imprisonment and then Paul was actually more strictly confined when he wrote 2 Timothy. I don't necessarily believe that, but I'll keep going. Conviction and execution, or exile from Rome. He could have been convicted and said, you are no longer allowed in Rome. Number 4, this seems very possible to me. Paul's accusers failed to appear. It wouldn't be the first time they failed to appear. They failed to appear before Festus. And the statute of limitations on holding someone who has not been accused, 2 years. Matches what Paul says of Paul in Acts, doesn't it? For 2 whole years, which has an end. Number 5, Emperor Nero rules that Paul has done nothing worthy of chains or death, and he's released. Possible. Emperor Nero rules. Charges are irrelevant to Roman law. That had happened among all the other ones that Paul had appeared before. Happened in Corinth. Happened in Philippi. They had nothing to accuse him of. We're just not sure, honestly. I don't know for sure. I think the statutes of limitation ran out and they released him. But that's a guess. You can guess something just as good as I can. Well, what do we know? What we do know is what the Bible gives us. And I've talked about the 2 whole years. And let's go to slide number 12. This is what Paul said. At my first offense. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. At my first offense. If you say first offense, what does that assume? There's a second. At my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. Well, may it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me so that the message might be preached fully through me. I can just see Paul, because I've seen him before Felix and before Festus and before King Agrippa and before other dignitaries. I can see Paul stepping up Nero, and he said, "It is such a great honor, Emperor Nero, to stand before you. And I want you to know that I am accused for the hope of Israel. I have done nothing wrong against Roman rule nor Jewish rule." And he preaches the gospel to that man. That's what he says, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Now, I cannot say 100% that the mouth of the lion was the Roman Empire or even the Caesar. But I can say that as we have the eagle who represents our nation, so the lion represented the Roman Empire. I would say that is unique to the New Testament if that is the case. But what else is he talking about? He could be talking about Satan, who is a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. That's just as legitimate. But I want to think in this context, at my first defense and delivered from the mouth of the lion, indicates that Paul did appear before the Caesar, and he was, by the grace of God, delivered. Next slide. Paul expected to be released. I couldn't put all of this, well, I could have, but it would just made more slides. So I've got to turn to Philippians chapter 1. This is where we start Bible surfing. And what I want you to see as we Bible surf through Paul's writings is that Paul expected to be released. In his first imprisonment, he said many times, I'm about to be released. Philippians chapter 1, verse 23. He says, "For I am hard pressed between the two." The two what? Having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. To stay here or go to heaven. I don't know if y'all ever have days like that or not, but I do. Lord, this would be a good day to come get me out of here. And Paul says, I'm hard pressed between the two, to stay here or to go be with Christ, which is far better. He's in prison, remember? And the potential of execution is real in his life. But he says, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. I need to stay here. I've got more work to do. I've got you guys that I need to help. I've got the Corinthians, I've got the Ephesians, I've got the Thessalonians, I've got my brothers back in Jerusalem. There is still more work to do, and by the way, I've got to go to Spain. Verse 25. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for the progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. Paul says, I'm getting out of here. I'd rather go be with the Lord. But there's work to be done, and I'm going to be released, and I'll be seeing you. Philippians chapter 2, verse 24. It's on your slide. But I trust, and you see my little brackets there, it is the word I am persuaded. I am persuaded in the Lord that I myself shall come to you shortly. Philippians 2 and verse 24. We've read Philemon, but let's read it again. He told Philemon while in prison, prepare a guest room for me, for I trust, confident expectation, that through your prayers I shall be granted to you. But he said in 2 Timothy, quite a different tone later, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. Totally different thoughts, right? Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And go ahead and go to 15. So, based on the assumption, and I think it's a little bit stronger than the assumption, that Paul was released after 2 years in his first imprisonment, then what did he do? Open up a Bible shop in Rome? He could only sell the Old Testament. New Testament wasn't it? If he wanted to sell the Psalms and Proverbs in the New Testament, but he couldn't sell the New Testament because it wasn't collected yet. So. No, he didn't stay around in Rome and open a Bible shop. He went on preaching the gospel like he said he was going to do. So the order of Paul's possible travels cannot be known. Now, I'm going to draw a map later, but understand that it is just my efforts to sketch out a possible travel route for what we would call Paul's fourth missionary journey. There are several places in the Scriptures where Paul traveled to, possibly a 2 to 4 year period. Now, we don't know everything, of course, but we do know some things. And so I think I put all of these on the slide. If not, we'll turn to them. So in slide number 15, one of the first places we hear that Paul traveled to was Macedonia. Now, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are the three books that we refer to during this time of Paul's life. They don't fit historically, chronologically, anywhere else. In the first journey, of course, no, not even close. Second journey, not even close. Third journey, probably not. There's just no place. Timothy was always with Paul. And Paul he said, I left you in Ephesus. Well, Timothy was with Paul. Even in the Roman imprisonment, Timothy was there. So the only place that we can even guess that these letters were written, First Timothy and Titus, are during this between the imprisonment times. So, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia. It's very likely that maybe one of the first places that Paul went after being released from prison, unless he went to Spain, we don't know that, is that he went to Macedonia. And he told Timothy at the time, remain in Ephesus that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. He said, Paul's in Macedonia, he did this all the time, sent Timothy on to Ephesus, he said, go on to Ephesus. And then he wrote this letter of 1 Timothy to him while he was traveling about. So he said, I told you while I was in Macedonia for you to go to Ephesus. And I've said a lot of this already. But Paul had been with, or Timothy had been with Paul during his Roman imprisonment, Philippians 2:19. But Paul told Timothy to stay in Ephesus while he was in Macedonia. I've said all that. Slide 16. Paul had left a cloak, some books, and a parchment in Troas. 2 Timothy 4:13. And he tells Timothy to bring these things to him. We'll talk about 2 Timothy later, but 2 Timothy, Paul is in prison again. And it's not, I'm going to be delivered by your prayers, prepare a guest room for me, I'm coming to see you. He says, I'm done. I've finished my race. It's over. I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, which basically means the drink offering was you put the sacrifice on the altar, the altar, and then after it is already burning, then you pour the drink offering on top. So the indication is I'm already dying. I'm already in the process of being sacrificed. So, Paul says, bring these things to me. I sure would, because I just love studying about Scripture. I want to know what those books and parchments are. I don't know. But I want to think they're original autographs of the Bible. I want to think that they're 1st and 2nd Thessalonians by Paul's own ink. I don't know what they were, but they were very important. Why did he leave them in Troas? For safety, for safekeeping. When you're traveling about. So he was in Troas at some point. The only other time that we know he was in Troas was when third missionary journey, when he had left. Second. I'm confused now. Give me a minute. Get my journeys back in my head. Third missionary journey, Ephesus. Second missionary journey. When Paul preached till midnight and Eutychus falls out of the window. That's the only other time we know he was in Troas. That seems like a really long time for Paul to have requested these items. He probably requested the cloak because he likely at this imprisonment, 2 Timothy, he was in a dungeon. And there was no heat. And it was cold. And he needed extra covering. (17) is a map that shows you these places that we're talking about. Paul said, I've been to Macedonia. I've been to Troas. Next slide. Paul mentions Erastus staying in Corinth and Trophimus sick at Miletus. Paul told the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, we're in 2 Corinthians. Paul told the Corinthians, I'm coming to see you. For the third time. First time, church was established. Second time, Acts chapter 20, Jews plotted against him. Third time, he hadn't been there yet. Seems that he was there. 2 Timothy 4:20 says, Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I have left in Miletus. Left indicates Paul was there. When you leave somebody there, you have to be there to leave something. So Paul says, I've been in Corinth, I've been in Miletus. Where's Miletus? Just on the other side. This is where Paul met the Ephesian elders. It's just outside of Ephesus. (19). Paul left Titus in Crete. We have no information about Paul ever ministering in Crete. The only time he was ever around Crete was when he was on a ship as a prisoner telling those guys, we need to stay here. But Paul said, for this reason, I left you. To leave somebody, you have to have been there. I left you in Crete. You should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I command you. Next slide. Paul traveled to Nicopolis. There is no Nicopolis, and it's not even really on the, I'll show you a map in a moment, but it's not even on the journey map. It's not even, the closest Paul ever got to Nicopolis in the book of Acts is Corinth. Paul traveled to Nicopolis and he said, I spent the winter there. Probably because the sailors listened to him this time, because you don't sail in the winter. Titus chapter 3 verse 12. When I send Artemas to you or Tychicus, be diligent to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Next slide. Here's all the places. Miletus, just outside of Ephesus. Crete, you see that down at the bottom. Corinth. There's Nicopolis on the west side of the, what we think of as the Greece Peninsula. And it could be, though we don't know, that Paul is headed back to Rome. Because that would be the direction that you could go. If you are only way I know this is because books tell me this, but they show you the, sort of like as we have I-30 and 430, well, they have travel routes. These sailors over the years figured out the best way to travel around this area. So, with my handy-dandy computer pen, next slide, I drew a map. I have no idea if this is even close, but it's in the realm of possibilities of basically taking what Paul said in all of these different little places, and if we gauge the journeys we know about and how long they took, first, second, and third journey, and we look at this and we scale it chronologically, it's got to be 2 years. At least 2 years. History tells us Paul was released from prison AD 62, first imprisonment. He was there from 60 to 62. History tells us he died 64, 65. That's 2 years. Comments or questions? That's all I got. David.
Do you think he ever made a Spain?
$1 million question. Here's what I know historically. And let's understand. We get this ancient history, extra-biblical ancient history, from Christians. Whether we agree with all their doctrines, we have some interesting people in our history, but we won't get into that. But Christians who wrote 200. There's some writings in the 100s. So first century is 0, second century is 100, third century is 200. So some in the second century 100s, quite a bit in the third century. And there's this whole big, very expensive library of books that's in the seminary library, and it's very hard reading, that gives us some history. And they do say that Paul went to Spain. And there are a group of people, not everybody tells the truth, right? History kind of gets a little windy once in a while. But there are a group of people in the European area that we claim as forefathers in the faith called Paulicians. And they claim that their forefathers, now they're writing 500 or 600 AD, but they claim that their forefathers heard the gospel from Paul. And they're Europeans. That's all I got. Yes, Brother Owen?
The Welsh pastor told me that they believe that Paul came to England and Wales.
England and Wales.
But that's their tradition.
Welsh Baptist, their history, Paul came to England and Wales. Do we know? Not from the Bible, we don't. So, any other comments, questions? Well, if I let you go early, will you hold part of your offering back on Sunday? I didn't give you your money's worth. Let's talk about announcements, prayer requests. Deacons are going to meet right after the service. We're going to be talking about, of course, the big item, the $820,000 that we've been graciously given. Secondly, we are going to be talking about bringing back Sunday school. Be prayerful about that and what kind of precautions we need to take. So you be thinking about that as well, because it's going to come to you in business meeting on the 12th. So just be in prayer about that. And so we're going to meet here in just a little bit, talk about that. We have any other announcements? All right, then let's go to prayer concerns.